Okay. Chapter 2, 2. I hope the mic is working. Chapter 2, Sectarianization of Geopolitics in the Middle East. Introduction. Why does a chapter have to have its own introduction? Okay. Whether among policy gurus or media pundits, the quote ancient hatreds end quote theme has emerged as the preferred explanation for current domestic and regional political dynamics in the Middle East. Even Barack Obama, in his last State of the Union address in 2016, invoked history to explain the current regional turmoil, suggesting that, quote, the Middle East is going through a transformation that will play out for a generation, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia, end quote. More ominously, many people in the region have embraced this primordial sectarian narrative, explaining contemporary regional conflicts and domestic tensions by trampolining back to the 7th century when schisms first appeared among the leaders of the Muslim community over the succession of the Prophet Muhammad. Yet this kind of, quote, reading history backwards, end quote, is nothing but a tragic expression of what Edward Said long diagnosed as an Orientalist outlook, but also the pitfalls of, quote, the modern Orient, end quote, partaking in, quote, its own orientalizing. Also the pitfalls of the, quote, modern Orient, partaking in, quote, in its own orientalizing, uncritically and unconsciously internalizing Orientalism's subjugating a historic discourse. Little wonder then that when Saudi Arabia executed the Shia cleric Sheikh Nimar al-Nimar, I don't know how to pronounce his name, on January 2nd, 2016, the reverberations of this act assumed strictly sectarian overtones. Pro-Saudi pundits and audiences labeled him a Shia terrorist worthy of the gruesome punishments meted out against him, while Iran and her regional allies opportunistically appropriated his oppositional legacy, eulogizing him as yet another Shia victim of Riyadh's discriminatory policies. The reality of the situation is much more complex, however. As Toby Mathiasson contends, quote, Nimar's relationship with Iran was always more complicated than both Iranians and Saudi leaders claimed, and he had far more in common with the revolutionaries of the Arab Spring than with the Salafi jihadis executed alongside him, or the clerics who ruled in Tehran. Moreover, the timing of Nimar's execution had nothing to do with sectarianism. As March Lynch suggests, it was rather driven by secular political considerations preoccupying decision makers in Riyadh. These include the domestic and regional fallout from Saudi Arabia's geopolitical confrontation with Iran in multiple theaters, the perceived implications of the US Iranian nuclear deal, and Tehran's concomitant, what does that mean? Concomitant, excuse me, naturally accompanied or associated. Cool. The perceived implications of the US-Iranian nuclear deal and Tehran's concomitant reintegration into the global economic system for its strategic relation with Washington. And finally, the Saudi kingdom's perennial quest to assume leadership over a reconstituted Sunni regional order. Interesting. Yeah. To be sure, then, sectarianism explains very little in a region shaped by authoritarian regimes, incorporated lopsidedly into a capitalist world system, and penetrated by all kinds of external actors with neo-imperial interests. Instead, I argue in this chapter that the current wave of sectarianism engulfing the region is primarily driven by regime policies deployed to balance against often overlapping domestic and external security threats. More precisely, the recent spread of sectarianism like wildfire in the Middle East is rooted in how Saudi Arabia and Iran have deployed sectarian identity, narratives, and symbols to neutralize both domestic and external regime threats in what is otherwise a grand geopolitical contest. Already nascent before the December 2010 explosion of popular protest in the domestic politics of a number of weak Arab states, this geopolitical contest deepened dramatically after the uprisings began. They simply enabled it to spread to new arenas, namely the hitherto Habbasian. Oh, speaking of Hobbes, the philosopher, okay. Namely the hitherto Abbasian state of Syria, and altered their rules of engagement, as in Yemen, where Saudi air power and Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, is that what the GCC? I can't believe I'm just finding out now what GCC stands for. That's hilarious that I did not know that. Okay. Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC. What about GCC? Simply enabled sectarianism, to spread to new arenas, namely Syria. Altered the rules of engagement, as in Yemen, where Saudi air power and Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC troops were deployed to contain and reverse the military advances of the Houthi rebels. And if the US would have let them continue and finish the job, we wouldn't have to be dealing with it now. Just saying. Everybody knows this. The consequences of the US policy is very bipolar sometimes. I understand why, but it would be nice if it wasn't. The consequences of the sectarianization of this geopolitical contest are devastating, whether in the historically weak states such as Yemen, in Libya, or in the more robust ones such as Syria and Iraq. State institutions collapsed and societies fractured along newly securitized vertical cleavages. The concomitant regional explosion and reinvention of sectarian, tribal, or ethnic identities is thus not rooted in timeless, pre-modern, primordial cultural affinities. Okay, he's saying this is a modern problem. He's saying this is not because of what happened in however 1400 years ago. It is rather the consequence of the erosion of the post-uprising state coercive institutional and ideological power in a number of countries with plural societies, and the deployment by domestic and regional actors alike of sectarianism to defend their authoritarian orders against local rivals, or as a fig leaf for otherwise geopolitical battles. I mean, yeah, mostly checks out. Okay. The sectarianization of geopolitics before the Arab uprisings. Let me close this. Since its formation on the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, the Arab state system has been shaped by the overlap between the domestic, transnational, and geopolitical factors. This overlap assumed a number of forms, however, whether in the salience of immaterial ideational threats in the making of the Middle East international relations, domestic actors aligning with regional powers to balance against their domestic opponents, or the quote omni-balancing choices facing regime leaders. The interplay between domestic and regional levels served to the local agendas of both domestic actors and the geopolitical and state-building objectives of many states in the Arab world. I mean, I noticed that the only party that this doesn't benefit is basically the people. The 1990 to 1991 invasion and subsequent liberation of Kuwait exposed but also unleashed a set of overlapping domestic and trans-regional challenges that collectively underscored the challenges facing authoritarian regimes, the changing permeability of the regional system, and the explosion of transnational non-state actors. The 9/11 terrorist attack and the explosion of Al-Qaeda in the Arab world magnified the role of transnational actors in a new regional system in flux. Okay, so the battle for Iraq. Oh boy. Okay, the battle for Iraq. The 2003 U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq created a new regional landscape. Let me just put this here. Blah, 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 blah. New regional landscape. However, unleashing dynamics that ultimately restored the primacy of the overlapping domestic and geopolitical battles of the 1950s and 1960s. Henceforth, the region became a theater for the grand Saudi-Iranian geopolitical confrontation fought out not through classical realist state-to-state military battles, but rather through proxy domestic and transnational actors and in the domestic politics of a number of weak Arab states. Yeah, not a fan. Not a fan. As Gregory Gause, with a G, as Gregory Gause has carefully noted, from both Riyadh and Tehran, the two main protagonists in this geopolitical confrontation, but also Qatar and Turkey, the objective is, quote, not to defeat their regional rivals militarily on the battlefield. It is to promote the fortunes of their own clients in these weak state domestic struggles, and then thus build up regional influence. Essentially, gut out the country that you're in, that you're being a parasite in, gut it out completely, turn it into, excuse my language, some sort of prostitute, and use that as a place to spread whatever agenda you have. That's what I think about that. Yet, lest we deny them agency, domestic actors also possess their own calculations and interests. They invite and align with regional actors in a bid to balance the political influence of their domestic opponents and advance their own local political interests. Sabotaging post-Saddam Iraq was henceforth an objective not just of Washington's regional enemies, Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. Sabotaging post-Saddam Iraq was henceforth an objective not just of Washington's regional enemies, Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, but also of its allies. Especially Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Okay, basically they're saying everybody and their mother wanted to sabotage Iraq, apparently. Baghdad's Arab neighbors feared that a stable and democratic Iraq would allow Washington to pursue its post-9/11 freedom agenda aggressively. Consequently, they resisted U.S. attempts to stabilize and democratize Iraq, opening up their borders to Salafi jihadi fighters en route to Iraq. Washington's growing trouble in Iraq and Iran's ability to assume a dominant role in post-Saddam Iraq altered the geostrategic balance of power in the region and tipped it in Tehran's favor. Riyadh reasoned that if Iran's growing regional influence was left unchecked, then it would one day be forced to confront Tehran in the Persian Gulf, the kingdom's own strategic backyard. It considered Hezbollah and Hamas proxy instruments in this contrast, lacking any agency of their own, merely serving Tehran's geopolitical objective to penetrate and vivisect the Arab world. I assume vivisect means like to break it up, perform vivisection of an animal, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, cutting it up, Oops. With U.S. encouragement and support, Riyadh took the lead in balancing and reversing Tehran's growing regional influence, rallying to its side the, quote, moderate Arab states, consisting of Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, so moderate, all of these, Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and supported implicitly by Israel. Okay, so Riyadh got the green light. Tehran, on the other hand, sought to defend its newfound geopolitical position and expand its regional reach in alliance with Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas. Syria at this time is under Bashar al-Assad still, and I have to keep reminding myself that a lot has changed. Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, its junior partners in the Axis of Resistance, backed by Russia, on the international stage. While often described in sectarian terms, most famously by Jordan's King Abdullah, as a contest between allied Sunni states against an emerging, quote, Shia crescent, stretching from Iran to Israel's borders. This was, in fact, a very realist balance of power contest between two states over regional supremacy. Riyadh deployed sectarianism as an instrument of realpolitik to rally support within the GCC countries and across the Arab world to its foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran. The Saudis at first assumed a passive policy towards US-occupied Iraq. This stance turned more proactive with the approach of the US troops with withdrawal. This stance turned more proactive with the approach of the US troop withdrawal from Iraq in December 2011. Saudi strategy in Iraq henceforth consisted of preventing or sabotaging a complete Iranian takeover of the country. To this end, Riyadh marshaled an array of military and non-military assets in the Saudi repertoire. This included diplomatic support to pro-Saudi Sunni, as well as Shia politicians, material support to the Sunni tribal Sawa, in parentheses it says awakening groups in their war against Al-Qaeda. I've never heard of the Sawa. S-A-H-W-A. Sawa. There's also a village called Al-Sawa in southern Syria. Okay, this included, right, so Riyadh got a bunch of military, non-military assets, diplomatic support to pro-Saudi Sunnis, as well as Shia, material support to the Sunni tribal Sawa, and the war against Al-Qaeda, and intelligence penetration of Salafi jihadi groups operating in Iraq. Riyadh was unable to prevent Iran's geopolitical victory in Iraq, though. The Saudis consequently opted to destabilize Iraq, a strategy that wrought havoc on the country, turning the contest over post-Saddam Iraq into a sectarian war. Iran, for its part, used its political skills and paramilitary experience of the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force to deny Washington a stable Iraq. And Syria opened its borders to Salafi jihadi fighters destined for Iraq, and Hezbollah operatives in Iran and Iraq trained Shia Iraqi groups in guerrilla warfare against US troops. So dramatic. The sectarianization of the geopolitical battle over Iraq, coupled with the post-2006 sectarianization of Iraqi politics, gradually transformed the country into another site for overlapping domestic and geopolitical battles. As Toby Dodge argues persuasively, the emergence of sectarianization as a primary mode of political mobilization in post-Saddam Iraq is a result of the, quote, deliberate development or reinvention of sectarian identities by a ruling elite that judges this as the best method for rallying an alienated electorate. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Damn. I mean, it's not a good idea. It's still not a good idea. I'm saying I understand why they did it, even though I don't think it's a good idea. And it is ultimately destructive in the end. Okay. Former Prime Minister Nuri, it's identity politics. People, very persuasive. Very primordial, very persuasive. Former Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki Maliki's vengeful sectarian clientists. Politics between 2006 and 2014 go a long way in explaining the alienation of Iraq's Sunni community, and consequently the ability of ISIS to capture large swaths of what is the Sunni heartland in Iraq and maintain a continuous supply of recruits into its ranks. The consequences for Iraqi nationalism and territorial unity were disastrous, however. Centrifugal pressures are on the rise at the expense of unitary nationalist sentiments, exacerbating ethno-sectarian suspicions, mistrust, and misapprehension between Sunnis and Shias, and between Baghdad and Erbil. For the Kurds in the north, a combination of hypermobilization in defense of the ethnic motherland, plus the protection offered by the international political economy of oil, the support of regional Israel and international US allies, and good geopolitical fortunes granted them a state in all but name. Who, the Kurds? The Kurds. As a result, Baghdad and everything south of it has become a bastion for a posse of pro-Iranian Shia political parties and militias. Baghdad and everything south of it. While the wasteland northwest of Baghdad is a zone of contention among Sunni tribes, ISIS, and disgruntled former Baathi apparatchiks, Baath guys. Huh. Okay, hold on a second. Let me just look at a map here. Baghdad. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about everything south of it and then the northwest of Baghdad. Oh, I see. So close to Syria's border. Hmm. Okay. Iraq is really in the middle of everything. So you've got Iraq here in the middle. You have Syria up here to the northwest. You've got who's on the right hand side? You have Iran here. You've got Saudi on the bottom. Where's Kuwait? You've got Kuwait here in this little spot in the corner. Israel is further this way. Oh, I hate not completely sneezing. Okay. Oh, and then in the north you've got Turkey, of course. Right. Oh. We've got the southern border of Turkey there. What page was I on? Here. Okay. Baghdad, everything south. Okay. Okay, so that's Iraq. Now we're on to Lebanon, then Syria, and then it's going to talk about a little bit about Arab uprisings, Turkey, Saudi, and then Syria again. Okay, let's see. Oh, and then Iran. This is a long chapter, and then Yemen. Okay, I'm not sure I'll do this all in one sitting. We'll see. Turkey. Where's Lebanon? Lebanon. Lebanon. Lebanon is right there. Lebanon is my neighbor, technically speaking, physically speaking. Lebanon became part of the geopolitical scramble for the region immediately following the fall of Baghdad. Emboldened by its swift victory in Iraq, Washington demanded Syrian cooperation in the Cold War on Terror and the stabilization of post-Saddam Iraq. And it also requested an end to Syrian interference in Lebanese affairs, the demobilization of disarmament of Hezbollah, and the dismantling of its rocket arsenal in South Lebanon, and the deployment of the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, all over all Lebanese territory, including the southern borders with Israel. Syria's refusal to comply with the US demands elicited UN Secretary Council Resolution 1559 of September 2nd, 2004. The resolution declared its support for, quote, a free and fair electoral process in Lebanon, Lebanon's upcoming presidential election conducted according to Lebanese constitutional rules and devised without foreign interference or influence. That's hilarious. It also called on, quote, all remaining foreign forces to withdraw from Lebanon. Well, that didn't happen. And mandated the disbanding and disarmament of all Lebanese and non-Lebanese militias. That definitely didn't happen. Read Hezbollah and pro-Syrian Palestinian groups in the country. Henceforth, UNSCR 1559 became a tool against Damascus in the grander geopolitical contest. As discussed in my other chapter in this volume, the architecture of sectarianization in Lebanon, the assassination of Lebanon's former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, and the subsequent withdrawal of Syrian troops from Lebanon unleashed an overlapping domestic, regional, and international contest over post-Syria Lebanon. On one side was the USA, France, and the moderate Arab states, and their Lebanese allies in the March 14 coalition, led by the Sunni-dominated Future Movement. On the opposing side stood Syria, Iran, Syria, and the Lebanese allies led by Hezbollah. So anytime I start talking about Lebanon, I start getting a headache. I'm telling you. Okay. The former group sought to reposition Lebanon away from the Syrian-Iranian geopolitical camp, while the latter resisted these efforts. On its own, Lebanon carried little weight, however. It was rather an open battlefield for the Saudi-Iranian geopolitical contest, correct, in which each side sought, as Gauss put it, to promote the fortune of their own clients in these weak state domestic struggles and thus build up regional influence. If you have a country, don't let this happen to your country. Just saying. Moreover, threatening to snatch Lebanon away from Syria's orbit was one way to force Damascus to cooperate in Iraq. Similarly, besieging Hezbollah in Lebanon would undermine Iran's geopolitical reach and Syria's regional influence. Consequently, from February 2005 until the promulgation of the Qatari negotiated May 21st, 2008 Doha Accord, the choreography of Lebanese politics closely followed excuse me, the geopolitical script written by regional and international actors. Riyadh and Washington raised the sectarian ante and drowned Hezbollah in a sectarian quagmire to contain the party's efforts to assume control over post-Syria Lebanon, but also to tarnish its appeal as a trans-Islamic and pan-Arab liberation movement. Okay. I think I have a little bit more. I think I have a little more patience. I'm not going to finish. Should I finish the chapter? Mm, 26 pages. Okay, let's see. The Syrian Crucible. Syria was also at the heart of Saudi Arabia's strategy to contain Iran's growing regional influence. Like Washington, Riyadh viewed Damascus as the umbilical land cord linking Tehran to Hezbollah and Hamas, the bridge allowing Iran to project its political power in the region and its material capabilities along Israel's border. And this is correct. Moreover, Iran's alliance with Syria provided Tehran with political cover for its growing influence and interference in what Riyadh viewed as otherwise strictly Arab affairs. Moreover, Iran's alliance with Syria. Consequently, Riyadh was determined to challenge Syria's influence in every Arab nook and cranny in an attempt to punish it for its alliance with Iran and compel it to distance itself from what was developing under Bashar al-Assad into a very close but unbalanced relationship with Tehran. This was especially true in Lebanon, Syria's own security backyard, and the arena from which Damascus traditionally sought to project its own regional power. Riyadh was quick to accuse Damascus of being behind the Hariri assassination and pressured it to withdraw its troops swiftly from Lebanon and desist from interfering in its neighbors' domestic policies. For its part, Damascus accused Riyadh of interfering in its own security arena and domestic politics by financing Salafi groups and jihadi cells in Lebanon and Syria, and by fomenting sectarian sentiments against the Syrian and Iranian regimes in regional organizations. This Saudi-Syrian confrontation came to a temporary halt only after Qatar succeeded in negotiating the 2008 May Doha Accord, which ended Lebanon's political stalemate following Hezbollah's military takeover of Beirut, paving the way for election of a consensus presidential candidate, Army Commander General Michel Michel Suleiman on May 25th, 2008, and the formation on July 11th, 2008 of a national unity government. Qatar's success in negotiating the Doha Accord underscored the dynamic regional role it assumed, blah, 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 during the pre-uprising period. Situating itself between the two regional camps, Doha deployed its financial and domestic diplomatic assets to mediate multiple inter-Arab conflicts. By diplomatic assets, it just means knowing how to be two-faced. That's when they're talking about Doha. That's what they mean. Well, maybe that's not what they mean. That's how I interpret it. Let's be fair and accurate, yeah? I speak for myself, not for the author, and he speaks for himself. So, Doha deployed blah, 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 whether between, okay, so Doha deployed financial and diplomatic assets to mediate multiple inter-Arab conflicts between Saudi and Syria, Iran, and the other Gulf states, or between competing groups in Sudan, Yemen, Lebanon, or in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It cultivated strategic ties with Washington and served as a base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet, hosted Salafi outcasts, but also used Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi and the Al Jazeera satellite channel to respectively control the Muslim Brotherhood's ideological production. How generous of them. How absolutely generous. And co-opt mainstream Islamist popular opinion. And finally, I mean, just such a neutral mediator for everybody. Absolutely wonderful. Positively like Switzerland. Finally, it boasted open relations with Israel. Qatar's unorthodox foreign policy, and shame on anyone in Israel who took money from Qatar. Shame on them, especially in the last few years. Qatar's unorthodox foreign policy mix of balancing bandwagging, unorthodox foreign policy mix of balancing bandwagging co-optation and accommodation aimed at insulating the small sheikhdom from multiple regional threats it faced in its immediate security environment. Okay, so that's that about that. Lebanon, Syria, Riyadh, Doha, okay. The sectarianization, this is a new section in the same chapter. Sectarianization of geopolitics after the Arab uprisings. So, that should be interesting. The Arab uprisings subsequently transformed the behavior of a number of Middle East states and ultimately invited direct external, namely Russian, military intervention in the region's geopolitical battles. Both Qatar and Turkey abandoned their former pragmatic stances and jumped on the uprising's bandwagon to carve out new regional roles for themselves. Qatar used its affiliations with the Muslim Brotherhood to co-opt Islamist parties that assumed power after authoritarian regime breakdown in a bid to bolster its geopolitical weight. The small sheikhdom played a proactive role in regime change in Egypt and Libya, shelved its former differences with Riyadh, and openly endorsed regime change in Syria, offering a bevy of Salafi jihadi groups military material aid, and it led an Arab League campaign to ostracize Damascus and expel it from Arab organizations, threatened to apply the full weight of the UN charters, chapter VII, is that 5, 6, or 7? I don't know Roman numerals. Against the regime, successfully engineered Hamas's exit from Iranian-Syrian alliance and emerged as a proxy for NATO and Washington in their effort to contain Iran. In Egypt, Al Jazeera played an instrumental role popularizing and defending the Muslim Brotherhood's position in the contest between Islamist and secular groups over the drafting of a new constitution. Doha also embraced the politically beleaguered presidency of Mohamed Morsi, supplying it with an emergency lifeline, financial lifeline, that amounted to some $7.5 billion in its first year in power. Yet in the aftermath of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's Saudi-backed coup in July 3rd of 2013, Egypt returned to Doha some $2 billion deposited by Qatar in the central bank. Thereafter, relations between Egypt and Doha turned sour, and the latter turned its geopolitical attention to Syria. Okay, so that's interesting. Turkey. Turkey's role in the region also changed after the uprisings as Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Erdogan. Okay, I didn't know his first name. Became increasingly set on regime change in Syria, turning more authoritarian at home against both the domestic opposition and the Kurds, and his discourse assumed unabashedly sectarian overtones. Ankara's stance vis-a-vis Syria mutated from being a close ally of Bashar's regime, mediating between Damascus and Tel Aviv, shielding Assad from Riyadh's sectarian accusations. At its moment of peril, immediately after Hariri's assassination, and using Damascus as a bridge to establish its own geopolitical influence in the Arab world, to potential mediator between the Syrian regime. Okay, so using to potential mediator between the Syrian regime and the opposition in the early stages of the uprising. Then, an open critic of the regime's violent crackdown on the uprising, and finally to being Riyadh and Doha's active ally in their determination to topple the regime at any cost. What happened to that? Did they help in the end? That's a good question. Consequently, Turkey's borders with Syria became awash with all kinds of Salafi jihadis from all over the world seeking to join what was marketed as a war against a minority Shia-aligned regime oppressing the Sunni majority. Turkish intelligence played an instrumental role, funneling weapons and material to these groups in a bid to not just topple Bashar's regime, but also to balance against the growing Kurdish autonomy and military assertiveness in Syria's northeast. And that region is still under question today, obviously, the Kurdish region. Indeed, as Dexter Filkins argues, ISIS, quote, would never have metastasized as virulently as it has without Turkey's assistance. Turkey's involvement in Syria and its failure to topple the regime in Damascus generated much domestic pushback. However, sectarian and ethnic sentiments are on the rise in the country. A new wave of state-orchestrated violence has led to the military insurgency in the Kurdish regions, and ISIS ultimately turned its suicide attacks against Turkish cities. Okay. Moreover, Erdogan's instrumental use of the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated political parties across the Middle East to promote Turkey as a leader of a revived Sunni regional camp clashed with Riyadh's own leadership aspirations. Alternatively, efforts to reach an accommodation with Riyadh after the failure of Erdogan's Syrian policy are bound to alienate Iran, an erstwhile ally Oh, erstwhile means former. Okay, a former ally. At a time when Ankara is increasingly dependent on the latter for natural gas imports, given the nosedive Russian-Turkish relations have taken after Turkey shot down a Russian military plane in November of 2015. Outmaneuvered by Riyadh on the Sunni front and unable to advance its political agenda in Syria, Turkey responded by intervening in Iraq in December 2015 and stationing troops near Mosul in an effort to carve out for itself a sphere of influence in northern Iraq. If anything, Erdogan's policies have taken Turkey from a foreign policy aimed at zero problems to a political quagmire. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that is Turkey. They tried to fix a bunch of things, and it looks like they broke a bunch of things instead. Okay. Saudi Arabia. I'm just reviewing Turkey real quick. Yeah, they really. Turkey's borders can't. Yeah. Yep. ISIS. Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, goodbye, Turkey. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia. Wow, that's really sour. Okay. Mm-mm-mm. Most startling, however, is the growing assertiveness of Saudi Arabia's role in the region as it abandoned its tradition of quiet petrodollar diplomacy and proxy geopolitical battles for a newfound political bluntness and direct military intervention with dire implications for sectarian sentiments in the region. Saudi Arabia's original stance vis-a-vis the uprisings was shaped by very real domestic and geopolitical objectives: to insulate the kingdom from the democratic winds of the Arab Spring, protect the survival of the monarchical regimes, and undermine Iran's power in the region. It thus used its military forces, financial largesse, and political clout There's a lot of kids playing outside. Okay. I don't know if you can hear them. Used military, financial stuff, political stuff to contain the effects of the uprisings on the Arabian Peninsula, but especially in Bahrain, Yemen, and Oman. Riyadh also extended financial assistance to support the monarchies of Monaco and Jordan. Morocco, sorry, not Monaco. Morocco and Jordan against mounting domestic calls for reform in a bid to obviate, it means to remove, in a bid to remove any change among sister monarchical regimes. Okay. Saudi Arabia was vocal in its opposition to the Morsi government in Egypt, labeling the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Riyadh played an instrumental role in orchestrating Sisi's coup and supporting the new regime both politically and financially. King Abdullah minced no words praising Sisi's seizure of power and shielded the new regime from both Washington and Doha, declaring on August 16, 2013, that, quote, the people and the government of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia stood and still stand today with our brothers in Egypt against terrorism, extremism, and sedition, and against whoever is trying to interfere in Egypt's internal affairs. Okay, so that's what he said. Alongside the UAE and Kuwait, with whom it shares a deep antipathy towards the Muslim Brotherhood, Saudi Arabia raised some $12 billion in emergency funds for the Sisi regime and pledged to compensate Egypt for any loss of American or European aid as a result of the military coup. Sisi's regime spent some $20 billion of aid money, $20 billion, from its Gulf allies without much impact on the government's balance sheets. Riyadh's open support for the Sisi regime showed how far it was willing to go to contain and reverse the political consequences of the popular uprisings. In its indirect support for anti-Islamist factions vying for power in Libya, namely via Egypt and the UAE, exposed the extent to which it considered the Muslim Brotherhood to be a threat to the survival of its own non-participatory and total obedience model of governance. Okay, which is why it makes complete sense that the Muslim Brotherhood is welcome across most of the Western world. It makes total sense. Total sense. Okay, Riyadh's use of sectarianism. I mean, it does. If you're a globalist, it makes sense. If you're a globalist, the Muslim Brotherhood is not exactly a proxy, but essentially an ally. Not really an ally, but yeah. Anyway, Riyadh's use of sectarianism, a tool. The Muslim Brotherhood, I would say it's not an ally, it's not a proxy, it's a tool for globalists. Riyadh's use in the same way that, never mind. Riyadh's use of sectarianism as an instrument of regional policy became more pronounced after the popular uprisings. It manipulated Shia. Okay, so Riyadh's use of sectarianism as an instrument of regional policy became more pronounced after the popular uprisings. Just in Saudi or outside of Saudi as well? Let's find out. It manipulated Sunni Shia divisions and sentiments to shore up support for its regional allies and isolate Iran and its respective Arab allies and proxies. Riyadh justified its military intervention in Bahrain's uprising by characterizing the latter as the work of Iran's Shia agents in the Gulf, ignoring their genuine demands for socio-economic and political reforms. It clamped down harshly on opposition in the kingdom's eastern province, labeling the demonstrators Iranian agents. Okay. Labeling demonstrators Iranian reads Shia Rawafid agents. Riyadh supported sectarian opposition against Iraq's pro-Iranian al-Maliki government and against the Hezbollah allied government of Najib Mikati in Lebanon, and accused Tehran of meddling in the kingdom's security backyard by supporting and arming Houthi rebels in northern Yemen. But nowhere were Riyadh's sectarian tactics more evident than in Syria, whose alliance with Iran it was determined to end. Okay. So, there's a lot about this last paragraph that is new to me and that I don't completely understand. I'm just much more unfamiliar with Saudi history. Let me just quickly review it. Okay. So Syria gave a lot of money to the Sisi regime. They spent a ton of that money. Sisi spent it. Right. Riyadh's support for the Sisi regime showed how far it was willing to go contain the reverse political consequences of uprising. So Riyadh really didn't want the uprisings to happen, the Arab Spring. They wanted the monarchical systems to continue. And which in some places is not necessarily a bad thing. Although it's complicated. It really depends where you're talking about and who you're talking about. Okay. Indirect support for anti-Islamic factions, fighting for power, blah, blah, blah. Riyadh's use of sectarianism as an instrument of regional policy became more pronounced. I'm just going to read this paragraph again. Became more pronounced after the popular uprisings. It manipulated Sunni and Shia divisions and sentiment to shore up support for its regional allies and isolate Iran and its respective Arab allies and proxies. Riyadh justified its military intervention in Bahrain's uprising by characterizing the latter as the work of Iran's Shia agents in the Gulf. Ignoring their genuine demands for socioeconomic and political reforms, it clamped down harshly on opposition in the kingdom's eastern province, labeling demonstrators Iranian Greek Shia Rawafid. Oh my gosh. Rawafidh. Rawafid agents. Riyadh supported the sectarian opposition against Iran's pro-Iranian al-Maliki government and against the Hezbollah allied government of Najib Mikati in Lebanon, and accused Tehran of meddling in the kingdom's security backyard by supporting and arming Houthi rebels in northern Yemen. Nowhere was Riyadh's sectarian tactics more evident than in Syria, whose alliance with Iran it was determined to end. Okay. The multi-level struggle for Syria. The overlapping domestic, regional, and international, quote, struggle for Syria is yet another chapter in the grand geopolitical contest underway between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the respective allies. Here again, sectarianism was deployed as a fig leaf for what were actually geopolitical battles. The metamorphosis of the popular uprisings in Syria from a peaceful demand for reforms under the existing authoritarian regime to a largely regime-induced civil war with strong sectarian reverberations created a new theater for this geopolitical contest. From a country with a defensive realist regime, preoccupied with the nimble footwork of the region's geopolitical battles, Syria was transformed overnight into a battleground for at least 3 overlapping contests: a domestic regime opposition battle that manifested itself in class, regional and sectarian undertones, a regional confrontation mainly between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar on one hand, and Tehran and its regional proxies, but especially Hezbollah on the other hand. So you have the domestic situation, you have the regional confrontation between these various alliances, and finally an international confrontation between a USA determined to contain and reverse Iran's regional influence and an ascendant Russia bent on insulating itself from the threat of radical transnational Islamic groups, protecting its Syrian bridgehead in the Arab world, and demonstrating its newfound international reach and stature. Okay, this sectarian geopolitical contest created a political, economic, and societal wasteland in Syria. The sectarianization by both domestic and external actors. It's pomegranate juice. Okay. The sectarianization by both domestic and external actors of vertical cleavages that have long coexisted with other class, ideological, or regional divisions ruptured the country along sectarian, religious, and ethnic lines. Riyadh's near obsession with regime change in Syria is shaped in part by the idiosyncratic I know this word, it's hard to say. Predilections. Riyadh's near obsession with regime change in Syria is shaped in part by the idiosyncratic predilections of Saudi decision makers. They have never forgiven Damascus for Hariri's assassination, nor have they forgotten Bashar's presumptuous words after the 2006 war with Israel, labeling Hezbollah detractors as, quote, half men. Idiosyncrasies aside, however, Riyadh's use of the popular uprising to push for regime change in Syria was driven primarily by realist geopolitical calculations. It consequently free rode on the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people to undermine Iran's regional influence. Riyadh sought to achieve this by toppling the regime of Iran's principal ally in the Arab world, replace it with one beholden to the kingdom, and furthermore, use regime change in Syria to tip the sectarian balance of power in post-Saddam Iraq in Iran's favor. In turn, regime change in Syria would deny Iran access to the territory of an allied state bordering Israel. In turn, regime change would deny Iran access. Subsequently curtail its ability to transfer weapons and military supplies to Hezbollah, and deny the latter its Damascus sanctuary used to procure military supplies and transport party cadres en route for training in Iran. As not only the producer but a major exporter of the Wahhabi worldview, Saudi Arabia funded and supported local Sunni Salafi rebel groups fighting in Syria to achieve its geopolitical objectives. Thus, in September 29th, on September 29th, 2013, it gathered some 43 rebel brigades under a new fighting force named Jaish al-Islam, which translates to the army of Islam, not the party, the army, led by Zahran al-Nush. Hold on a second, I need to plug. Oh, shoot. If I plug my computer in, I have to unplug the mic. Okay, we'll pause here.